The Financial Sense Midweek Edition with Jim Paplava. Delving in depth with authors and experts into the key economic issues.
Today, as the global economic slump drags on, economists bicker about whether stimulus or austerity is the solution. But the fact is that the real engine of economic growth has always been cheap, abundant fuel and resources. And those days are long gone, as are the easy answers to renewing prosperity. And that's the topic of today's subject. Joining me on the program is the author of a new book, Jeff Rubin, The Big Flat Line, Oil in the No-Growth Economy. And Jeff, one of the things that we've seen, especially coming out of the Great Recession, as they call 2007 and 2009, today's oil prices are changing the speed at which economies can grow. Just as people require food, economies require energy, and that relationship is straightforward. Economic growth is a function of our ability to produce and consume energy. Let's begin with that thought.
Well, I think that if you step back and look at, what's happened to oil prices in the last decade, where, we've gone from a world of $20 a barrel to a world of where Brent now trades above $100 a barrel, that you don't just change the speed at which you drive your car, you change the speed at which your economy can grow. Every major global recession that we've had in the last 40 years has had oil's fingerprints all over it, whether it's the OPEC oil shocks in the 1970s, whether it was the invasion of Kuwait when oil spiked to $40 a barrel in 1991, or the recent recession when we got to $147 a barrel oil prices. The only thing that's different now is in the past, in the 1970s, for example, someone turned off the tap. Today, the tap is wide open. Nevermore has run through the spigot. We're consuming almost 90 million barrels a day. The problem is that we can no longer afford what's running through the tap. And if we look at where we're getting oil today, that pretty well explains our predicament.
Something or a tool that economists often refer to, they talk about the economy's potential growth rate, and what the economy is actually producing is known as the output gap. The bigger the gap, the more policymakers believe they need to step on the gas to try to close it. But one of the things that does not go into their calculations today, and I'm sure it's not being discussed in Washington or the Fed, and that is the price of oil doesn't enter into the calculations governments use to determine how much stimulus is needed to help stir a flagging economy.
That's absolutely right, Jim, and it's a critical point because, if you look at the Fed's model, as is the model of most central banks, an economy's potential growth rate will be defined by the rate of growth of the labor force and the rate of growth of productivity. So let's just say the labor force is growing at 1% and productivity is growing at 2%, gives you a potential growth rate of 3%. And, there's no real recognition for what energy prices play in determining an economy's potential growth rate, even though the empirical record for the last 40 years, particularly for the U.S. economy and indeed for other economies, is that oil has a critical impact. And as I said in my opening comments, it's really got its fingerprints over every major oil recession. So in part, the problem is that the Fed still thinks that the U.S. economy can grow at the same 3% that it could when oil was $20 a barrel than when oil is nearly $100 a barrel. And so what they perceive when the economy is not growing at the rate that they expect is there's this big output gap or this huge amount of slack, and they would point to a near 8% unemployment rate. So they keep on flooring the gas. They keep on trying to stimulate the economy with either zero interest rates or trillion-dollar budget deficit. But as we're seeing, Jim, neither free money nor huge government spending is really a substitute for cheap oil. While they may give the economy a temporary jolt, the costs they leave behind, as the people in Greece and Spain can already attest to, just make the transition to triple-digit oil prices that much more difficult and problematic.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because it's certainly been the focus of this presidential campaign, and you and I are speaking on the day of the elections, because the Keynesian school, or the monetary school, is basically a pro-growth orientation when it comes to economic philosophy. So if you're growing at a slower rate, well, they talk about government intervention. The government needs to, as President Obama did, they came up with a stimulus spending program in 2009. The Fed launched QE1. Now we're on to QE3. And yet, Jeff, we're in the 1 to 2% growth rate. I guess the question here is, what if the global economy is entering into an era where static growth is the new normal? In short, what will happen if the economy stopped growing? And I guess if that's the case, what does that imply in terms of how a government manages a slower growth economy?
Well, I think that you hit the nail on the head. First of all, what's interesting is that whether you're a sort of Paul Krugman, let's stimulate till the cows come home, or a Milton Friedman, American Enterprise Institute type of person, the one common denominator is that you both are hooked on growth, and you both think that the economy can continue to grow. And of course, that's what both presidential candidates are offering Americans today, the prospect of economic growth. But neither can deliver on. Even with the policy levers at extreme settings, and certainly zero interest rates and $1 trillion budget deficit by any historic norm are unsustainable policy stances. Even with this unprecedented stimulus, the U.S. economy is barely growing at 2% with a jobless rate of close to 8%. What happens when this unsustainable stimulus gets turned off? What happens when you fall off the fiscal cliff? And I think what we're looking at is a no-growth economy. But, of course, that's not a message that we want to hear, so that's not a message that politicians deliver either in the United States or in Greece or Spain. But I think as time goes by, we should recognize that by pushing these policy levers, we're pushing on a string, we're making things more difficult. Instead of the printing presses running overtime at the Federal Reserve Board, and instead of the Treasury spending money like they've never spent before, maybe we should be thinking about things like job sharing, like the German Kurzarbeit program. Because, of course, the biggest challenge with a static economy or a low-growth economy is, what do we do about job creation? What do we do about unemployment? And I think job sharing probably has, more to do with the reality of today's economy than the promise of zero interest rates all of a sudden providing job creation.
I want to talk about something that I don't think is widely understood, and that is today's oil isn't flowing from the same places it did yesterday. More importantly, it's not flowing at the same cost. The IEA is talked about conventional production has already peaked. And what the decline in conventional production means, though, is that future economic growth, we're producing this stuff, but it's going to be a lot more expensive. It's coming from non-conventional sources. And I guess to the consternation of the peak oil crowd, we've seen shale production increase in the United States. We've seen tar sands production increase in Canada. So the oil industry continues to confound projections by getting better at pulling oil out of the ground, and that's kept the oil industry a step ahead of the best estimates for peak oil geologists. But however, if you take a look at where we're getting it, oil that used to come out from, let's say, Spindletop in Texas is not the same kind of oil that we're pulling off the shores of Brazil in the tar sands or in North Dakota.
That's absolutely right. If peak oil has any meaning, its real meaning is not what we can drill, but what we can afford to burn. And there's a big difference between the two concepts. One's a geological concept, the other is an economic concept. As you rightfully point out, Jim, every time the peak oil folk have drawn a line in the sand, the oil industry has crossed that line by accessing oil out of unconventional sources. But the problem is that they're doing that at increasing costs. And the problem being that the kind of prices we need to lift tomorrow's supply translates into oil prices that cause oil-consuming economies to stop growing. So while higher oil prices lift new supply, they also kill demand. And that's really the catch-22. I mean, for example, take the Alberta tar sands, for example, which, according to the International Energy Agency, is the third largest oil reserve, next to only Saudi Arabia and the heavy oil belt in the Orinoco in Venezuela. Well, you know, when oil fell to $40 a barrel during the last recession, some people thought that meant that oil was cheap and abundant. On the contrary, oil was never as scarce because you shut off huge sources of supply. For example, the Alberta tar sands. Production of synthetic oil from bitumen doesn't make sense at $40 a barrel, and they cut some $50 billion of CapEx in Fort McMurray. And not just in Fort McMurray, in Brazilian subsalt, in the Venezuelan Orinoco, in Arctic deep water. None of the sources that we're counting on for tomorrow's supply, while they physically exist, are going to flow at prices that we can afford to burn. And that's really the hub of our problem.
Let's relate this to what we see going on around the globe. We discussed briefly the United States is running trillion-dollar deficits in order to stimulate the economy. In fact, I've heard the argument, if you subtract the deficit, the U.S. economy's in a recession. We're seeing the pig countries. Greece has had to restructure its debt. Let's talk about the implications that higher oil prices imply for debt-ridden economies, as we're seeing in Europe, in the United States, and even in Japan.
Well, I think in a sense, all of that debt can be denominated into barrels of oil, because the only way that the so-called pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, and some might even make this argument for the U.S., but certainly for the pigs, the only way that they can service their debt is through a huge rebound in economic growth. But the problem is that a huge rebound in economic growth is just going to mean that the world's going to be consuming more and more oil, and instead of Brent being $105 a barrel, Brent would quickly be $130 to $140 a barrel. So it's almost as if, like, all of that debt that's denominated in euros could be denominated in barrels of oil. I mean, the reality is that the Greek and Spanish economies continue to contract, that a default is inevitable under those circumstances, and that ultimately what we're going to see is the dissolution of the euro, or at least what we're going to see is the euro become a very different monetary union minus its southern flank. But I think, you know, the notion that we can grow ourselves out of the debt that we have accumulated fighting the last recession ignores the reality that oil's already beyond our economy's ability to burn it or to afford it, and that any pickup in economic growth would just mean that oil prices would become that much more punitive.
I want to move on to the Middle East in the events that we've seen transpire over the last 2 years with the Arab Spring, the Arab Revolt. It's currently taking place in Syria right now, although there's still some conflict going on, as we found out recently, in Libya. And all the measures that I have seen about future oil production, even the IEA, Jeff, assumed that, well, we'll need X amount of barrels of oil 5 years from now or 10 years from now based on economic growth, especially from the emerging world, and it's going to come from OPEC. And yet when I take a look at who in OPEC is able to really crank out the necessary oil that we're going to need besides these unconventional resources, I look at Saudi Arabia. And there's, various arguments that have always been put forth when it comes to Saudi Arabia. The giant oil fields that have served the country still have considerable headroom to pump out more barrels. They can turn to new extraction methods that we've developed with technology. And when the output does begin to decline, the kingdom has all kinds of proven reserves waiting on tap in a large area of unexplored potential. How would you argue about that? Because if they can produce, as everyone believes they can, or at least thinks they can, then why haven't we seen it? I have yet to see Saudi Arabian production go over 10 million barrels.
Well, even more fundamental than that is that we are making the misnomer that what they produce, they will export to us. And I think that if you look at the trend for the last 10 years, you're seeing that that is a very false assumption. Saudi Arabia, it may be producing 10 million barrels, but it's exporting less than it was 3 to 4 years ago, because domestic oil consumption in Saudi Arabia, and not just in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, in Iran, is growing at the most rapid rates as anywhere in the world. It's growing faster than in China and India. And what's happened is that in countries like Saudi Arabia, they're increasingly cannibalizing their own export capacity. I mean, Saudi Arabia burns close to 1 million barrels a day just to power its desalination plants. And I think so what we're finding is this growing disconnect between production and exports. And that, of course, is the classical mistake that we've made over the last decade, that we've just assumed that increases in production from the Middle East would translate into increased exports. The opposite is, in fact, happening. And, of course, the reason that oil consumption is growing so dramatically in the Middle East is the egregious subsidies that are in effect there, not only for gasoline, but realize that in places like the Middle East, they burn tremendous amounts of oil just to generate power.
You know, when you look at the IEA, they're counting on the Middle East and North Africa to supply 90% of this additional oil, but as you mentioned, they're consuming more of their own stuff. And if you look at the places that we're getting, I think Exxon just issued a report they're going to spend $200 billion in oil exploration, and it's going to be in the Arctic, in the deep water, it's going to be in shale. And they're also talking about a project in Russia that may cost almost $500 billion. So, Jeff, you know, one thing about this unconventional oil that we've been producing, it's going to get a lot more expensive. I can't imagine how more expensive it is to sink a hole offshore Brazil or someplace in the Arctic Ocean. I mean, that's got to cost a lot of money.
That's right. And again, that's the problem, that the world will never run out of oil in some absolute geological sense. But the places that we're now going to become dependent on as major sources of supply are going to require oil in the order of triple-digit prices that our economies are not going to be able to afford to burn. So maybe many of these exotic projects with, you know, as you say, $500 billion price tags, maybe they will never come to fruition because, like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and when they're modeling carbon emissions, the IEA, when they're modeling oil and coal consumption, are extrapolating growth rates from the last 2 decades and projecting them in the future. And I think that without economic growth, we're going to find that those growth rates in hydrocarbon consumption are going to come crashing down.
Let's talk about the emerging world, and especially China and India, because if you take a look at where all the major automobile companies have relocated and building plants, they're building them in China because that's where the future car market is, and they've already exceeded the U.S. market. What does this imply if China is going to be selling more cars? And I remember, I forget, it was a number of years ago, I think you were on CNBC, and you were trying to explain this, and they kind of dismissed the fact that, you know, some poor Chinese peasant was going to someday own an automobile, that the North American market would still be the king of car production. Well, we now know that China buys more cars than we sell here in the U.S. That's already taken place. What does this mean when you have, one, China and India buying more cars. What does this imply for the West? Because those cars are going to run on oil. Number two, you have countries like Germany, you have countries like Japan, who have powered their economy with nuclear power. After Fukushima, those nuclear power plants have been shut down in Japan, which means Japan now, like China, like India, is also going to be in the global market for oil and natural gas. Let's talk about those two related factors.
Well, it's interesting that you point out at the beginning of your remarks the conversation on Squawk Talk, the NBC program, about 4 or 5 years ago when I was still the chief economist of CIBC World Markets. We'd put out a report projecting that most of the demand growth, virtually all of the demand growth in oil would come from the developing world. And the interviewer said sardonically, are you trying to tell me that a whole bunch of starving peasants in China are going to be able to afford to fill up, but we in Manhattan aren't? And I pointed out that not everybody who was buying a car in China was a starving peasant, but indeed that was more or less what I was saying, that China would outmuscle in terms of purchasing power and get its share, an increasing share of world oil supply. And, if you look at China's oil consumption, it's gone from about 2 million barrels a day in the early 80s to about 10 million. If you look at America's oil consumption, it's dropped about 2 to 3 million barrels over the last 5 to 6 years. Certainly, when you look at the car market, the Chinese car market, already bigger than the U.S. car market, but even more compelling is the fact that in America, basically every person of driving age has a vehicle. In China, 1 of 17 have vehicles. So certainly tremendous opportunity for growth. But we got to understand that, in a world where world oil supply is not growing robustly, we're looking at a zero-sum world, that if China is going to all of a sudden double its oil consumption, other people are going to have to cut back on their oil consumption. And certainly one of the countries that would have to be very much included in that process is the U.S., which is still the largest oil-consuming economy. You talk about Japan. I think that's interesting what's happened in Japan and what's happened to nuclear. I think that, what we've seen in Japan is the fallout from that is not unlike what we saw from Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island. It's cast a pall over the whole nuclear power industry. In Japan, what's interesting, however, is because they've shut down some, I think, 52 of 54 nuclear reactors, is that while there has been a pickup in imports of hydrocarbons, probably the biggest factor has just been a reduction in energy consumption, or their program of Setsuden, energy conservation. And I think that's a very positive message, because ultimately that's what we've got to do. We've got to reduce our energy consumption. It's not a message that we want to hear, but what is interesting is that when countries have been forced to do that, as Japan has recently been forced to do that, they've been remarkably resilient and adaptive.
Jeff, I want to move on to something here in the U.S. Because of shale production increasing, we have politicians on both sides of the aisle talking about energy independence, which I think is somewhat ridiculous given the fact that we still import 9 million barrels a day or something like that into this country. Part of this election campaign, and I want to address how this figures into the U.S., is we've got a lot of tar sand oil that's being stuck at Cushing, which has brought the price of West Texas Intermediate crude down. On the day you and I are speaking, West Texas is almost $89 a barrel. It's $20 higher if you take a look at Brent crude. We have the Keystone Pipeline. In Canada, Canada's largest export is oil. So if the U.S. is basically telling Canada, don't build a pipeline, we don't want that oil, I know across the ocean the Chinese would certainly like it, and Canadian oil companies can get $20 more a barrel if they sell it to the Chinese versus shipping it down to Cushing. So let's talk about the implications, because this could be a serious blow for the United States, because in addition to Canada, we're also getting less oil from Venezuela, which is now going to China as well.
Yes. Well, okay, first of all, Jim, we should understand that while Canadian oil gets deadheaded in Cushing and gets about $20 a barrel less than world oil prices, U.S. ports basically pay Brent equivalent. And indeed, Lake Louisiana Sweet, which is the major feedstock out of the U.S. Gulf of Mexico, is a Brent priced equivalent. So the key for Canada is to get our oil to an ocean. And then it doesn't have to go to China. It can go to China. It can go anywhere. It can go to Los Angeles, or it can go to China or Japan. That would all be Brent prices. And I think, for Canada, there's a recognition that running a pipeline through the heart of the United States to get to world oil prices is kind of problematic, particularly when you're much closer to running a pipeline just through British Columbia and getting to world oil prices on the West Coast. Or indeed, if you want to run a pipeline through the continent, probably makes more sense for Canada to run its pipeline eastwards. Don't forget that the Maritimes and Quebec still rely on imported oil, ironically from the Venezuelan tar sands. Why couldn't they be supplied by the Alberta tar sands? I think the rejection of the Keystone Pipeline XL expansion is really a game changer. The amount of revenues that have been foregone are staggering. They're in the billions of dollars because this price differential has persisted for almost 2 years. And I think it's going to redirect the flow of oil. I mean, just as water does not flow uphill, oil does not flow to where it gets $20 a barrel less. And I think what we're finding is that notwithstanding geography and notwithstanding the fact that the U.S. is still the largest oil consumer, it makes more sense for Canadian oil to flow to the coast than flow south to the U.S. And I think that pipeline developments in the next 2 to 3 years will be reorienting that flow. If I could just follow up on that, because there's another point that you raised that is the issue of energy independence in the United States, and it sort of resonates in this politically charged environment. I think that's a total misnomer, because I think that the problem for America right now is not that someone has turned off the taps. It's not like the OPEC oil shocks where countries have imposed trade sanctions against the United States. The problem is that the cost of oil is getting too high. So it matters not that America becomes self-sufficient if it gets its oil from things like oil shales, means that it's got to pay $90 to $100 a barrel, because that's not really going to solve the problem. What America really needs is cheap oil, $30 to $40 a barrel oil, and unfortunately, it's not going to find that kind of oil. I mean, it can find oil in oil shales, but just like in the tar sands, that's not going to flow at prices that American motorists want to fill up at.
Let's take this forward to what this means about economic growth. We began our discussion talking about, economic growth coming out of the last recession, even with enormous amounts of stimulus, both at the federal level with the Obama stimulus and then now our third version of quantitative easing. We've seen anemic economic growth, 2% or less. We still have persistent high unemployment. Let's talk about how this plays out in the economy going forward, because if China and India continue to develop, if Japan goes into the market for energy now that they've shut down their nuclear power plants, the price of energy is going to go up. In fact, I think it's a telltale sign, Jeff, that with Europe in a recession, anemic economic growth in the U.S., Japan possibly in a recession, Chinese economic growth slowing, we're talking about Brent crude prices at 110. So what does this mean about economic growth going forward, number one? And number two, when does government wake up and say, wait a minute, something's different here? Fiscal stimulus isn't working. Monetary stimulus isn't working. And those countries that continue to operate by pumping out and taking on more debt are running into major problems.
Well, I think that it's happening right now. I think that, incidentally, China and India's potential growth rate is changing just as America's is, that the Chinese economy isn't going to be able to grow at 10% a year when Brent's over $100 a barrel, when we've already seen it decelerate to around the 7% range. And I believe when all is said and done that India and China might be growing at closer to 4 to 5%, but that would still be, significantly more than what we're seeing in North America or Europe. It's the coffee's been there to smell for a while. Perhaps a U.S. presidential election year is not the time for candid assessments of the economy. As I say, neither candidate could tell the American public that the U.S. economy just isn't capable of growing like it once was. That's not a message that the public wants to hear, but I think it's a message that the public will ultimately come to accept. And I think the importance of accepting that message is to realize, take the foot off the gas pedal, that the gas pedal, whether it's zero interest rates or $1 trillion budget deficit, it's not a substitute for $20 a barrel oil, and it's only going to make the transition more difficult. In America's case, it's particularly problematic because the debt of which Washington is accumulating at record rates, is essentially financed by America's adversary, China. And, that's problematic.
Let's talk about what is starting to unfold. One of the things, I guess, looking on the bright side, Jeff, is over the last 2 or 3 decades, we got what was called the FIRE economy, especially with finance in real estate. Manufacturing became a smaller portion of the U.S. economy, even though at one time we were the world's largest manufacturing country in the world. That shifted to China. But what I've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, the little sort of bits and pieces here and there, Airbus is talking about building a factory in the South. We're seeing car companies from Europe build factories here. You're seeing some of the international companies talking about bringing back some of their production here in the United States, because by the time you ship, let's say, iron ore to China or Singapore and then assemble it in China, put it on a boat, get it to Long Beach, then on a train, ship it across country, and then on a truck, it's changing the dynamics of the cost of manufacturing.
Absolutely, Jim. In fact, that was really the message of my first book, Why Your World's About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller, which came out in 2009, in which I argued that in a world of triple-digit oil, distance costs money. And the whole model of a global economy where we produce something at one end of the world, ostensibly to take advantage of the cheapest labor, and then sell it at the other end of the world, quickly becomes, penny wise, pound foolish, that everything from steel to food, what we save on wage costs, we more than squander on bunker fuel. And that was really inspired by a study that I had done while I was still the chief economist at CIBC World Markets, where we found that, lo and behold, when oil first crossed into triple digits, all of a sudden it became cheaper to make steel in the United States than import it from China. And, it's true, the wage advantage was still huge for China, but there was only an hour and a half labor time involved in making a ton of steel. And when you considered the kind of freight costs that were involved of importing iron ore from far away from Brazil and thermal coal from Australia, and then sending the finished product again across the Pacific and then distributing in North America by rail and truck, for the next thing you knew, it was once cheaper to make steel in America. So, who would have ever thought that triple-digit oil prices would breathe new life into our hollowed-out rust belt? But that's exactly what's happening, and that's maybe one of the few silver linings that we're seeing from triple-digit oil prices, that in a world of high energy costs, transport costs become critical and bring about the reemergence of local economies that we thought were gone forever.
What is this going to imply for the role of government going forward? And let's see if we can bring in for our listeners, the recent events with the Hurricane Sandy, and on the day you and I are speaking, it looks like another winter storm is coming into the same place. Because what really struck me about Sandy, or even Katrina and Rita, is how fragile the system is. We don't have the spare capacity, I don't care if it's gasoline or even on the electrical grid, to handle these crises. And so, in some ways, this should alert authorities that something's changed here. And how's government going to deal with, let's say, citizens in the future saying that, you know what, we can't promise you all these goodies because we don't have the money to pay for all this stuff?
Well, I think that already people are recognizing that. But when we talk about things like Katrina or Sandy, the increasing frequency of what were once deemed, one-in-a-century storms become everyday occurrences. When we see, for example, in Canada that the Arctic ice is melted, we know that there are profound changes in our climate. Now, normally when the economy falters, environmentalists lament the fact that environmental policy gets shunted to the back seat, if not the trunk. And if we couldn't get our act together to put a price, for example, on carbon emissions when the economy was robust, what chance do we have of doing that when all of a sudden the economy stops growing? But I think the positive news is that while on the policy front we may not expect much, slower economic growth itself is going to have a tremendous impact on lessening our environmental impact, and no more dramatically than on carbon emissions. I mean, I'll point out that carbon emissions fell in the U.S. economy in 2009, not because of anything the Senate did or Obama did, but simply because U.S. GDP stopped growing. And indeed, global emissions fell. And so the one big silver lining here is that in a world of much slower economic growth, even our seemingly inexorable drive to environmental self-destruction may run out of fuel.
In terms of what this might mean, you talk about some examples that have been successful, and yet, for example, you talk about the Danes.
Right.
They're very proud of their windmills, although much of the country still runs on coal. But we get back to that pricing structure, which has changed the dynamics of Denmark. And then you also talk about Germany in job sharing. Is this a possible glimpse of what may work going forward?
Yes, and I think that, you find countries that are much more energy efficient or so-called greener. It's not because they're genetically more efficient or greener. It's because they haven't been dealt the same kind of resources that North America has, and they've had to innovate. And, when you look at Denmark's success, it's not the windmills. 80% of their power is coal, which is the same amount that coal would contribute to China's grid. The difference being that China's emissions have grown exponentially. They dwarf even America's now. And Denmark's the country that's not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. They've reduced their emissions below 1990 levels. But the success of Denmark isn't their windmills. The success of Denmark is that no matter whether you get your house powered by coal or by wind, it's 30 cents per kilowatt hour. And lo and behold, people in Copenhagen consume about a third less power than they do in North America, and that's because power costs 3 times as much. The good news is wherever you live doesn't have to be particularly well suited for wind. That if your local utility charged 30 cents per kilowatt hour, you would find ways of using a lot less power. And Copenhagen isn't some energy wasteland. There aren't thousands of people lined up at the Canadian and U.S. embassies for visas. Indeed, Denmark has one of the happiest people in the world, and people from all over the world come to want to live in Copenhagen. I think that's a very positive message, and a message that we should soon be receptive to in North America.
There's been some arguments. I can think of Paul Ehrlich's book that came out, I think it was in the 70s, The Limits to Growth. Then there was Simon's argument that technology and other things would come about and we would have we would solve the problem. So here we are, 30, 40 years later. Who's going to win that argument?
Well, they made a bet in the 1980s after Ehrlich had written the human population bomb and predicted Malthusian culling, and Simon said that Ehrlich was ignoring human ingenuity and innovation. They made a bet over a basket of commodity prices, Simon arguing that, in fact, they would fall, Ehrlich arguing that they would rise because of the unrelenting force of more and more people. It's interesting that bet has often been used as economists to repudiate any notion of the limits of growth, but what's interesting is that no one's bothered recalculating it. If you would have made that bet in the last decade, in fact, it would have been a very convincing win on the Ehrlich side. And that's not because there hasn't been technological innovation. There's been tremendous technological innovation in the last decade. But whether we're talking about oil or whether we're talking about copper or potash or wheat, the simple fact of the matter is that supply has not been able to keep up with demand, not only for the massive increase in human population, and in that respect, Ehrlich was right because human population has almost doubled in the last 50 years, but equally important as millions of consumers trade in rice bowls for cheeseburgers and bicycles for Tatas in places like India and China, of course, resource consumption has gone through the roof.
How does this play out, finally, Jeff, in your opinion? Because one thing that we have seen over the last half century is we've seen enormous change. We've seen technological development. I mean, look at the things that we have access today, from our smartphones to our tablets to access to the Internet. In that half century, we saw the United States as the world's greatest superpower go from a manufacturing behemoth to a service-oriented economy. But I think in this new environment going forward, as you talk about bringing manufacturing back here to the U.S., the financial economy is going to play a smaller role, in the manufacturing economy a larger role, and I can't help but think that's a good thing. So in the end, do we figure this out?
Well, I think, Jim, you hit the nail on the head in the sense that tomorrow's economy looks much more like the economy of the past, when we did have a manufacturing sector where it did have a presence, not just in the labor force, but in GDP and in investment, that indeed, many of the things that Americans consumed were made in America. And I think that those days are coming back. It's not that there aren't going to be investment bankers or hedge fund managers, but do these people have to be 20% of GDP? I doubt that. I think that we're going to see a much smaller financial service industry in the future than what we see now, and probably less influence, economic and political, for Wall Street. I think that we will adapt, but I think a key to adapting is to lower our expectations, to recognize that the kind of growth rates that we've been benchmarking to for the last 40 to 50 years are unsustainable and are not on the table. But the sooner that we realize that, I think the quicker we're going to come out with policies like job sharing, like Setsuden, energy conservation, that are going to allow us to be resilient and adapt to this world of much higher energy costs.
Well, Jeff, certainly another fascinating book, and I've picked up on your theme of your world's about to get a lot smaller, and you can see this play out because certainly a lot of the economists and the politicians that they advise have certainly been perplexed on why the old remedies. I mean, you're talking about not just stimulative policies, you're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars that have been thrown at this economy, whether you take a look at our $6 trillion in new debt that we've added in the 4 years, or, the Fed now embarking on its third quantitative easing. I think this book makes a lot more sense in terms of what we're more likely to face. The name of the book is called The Big Flat Line, Oil in the No-Growth Economy. We've been speaking with its author, Jeff Rubin. Jeff, all the best to you, and another piece of fine work, in my opinion.
Thanks very much, Jim, and we'll be talking to you soon.
can subscribe to Financial Sense NewsHour in the iTunes and BlackBerry podcast libraries or at feeds.feedburner.com/FSN. Find more information about our guests at www.financialsense.com/newshour. Friend us at www.facebook.com/financialsenseonline. For our on-the-go listeners, you can access Financial Sense on your mobile device at m.financialsense.com. The Financial Sense NewsHour is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the NewsHour each involve their own unique risk factors, which are not discussed on the show. Responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of James Puplava and do not take into account listeners' suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Financial Sense NewsHour and its parent company shall not be liable for any financial losses that result from investing in any companies profiled on or advertising with Financial Sense, or arising out of the use of any material on the NewsHour. Be advised that you invest at your own risk.